It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon, March 15th, 2:43 p.m. to be exact, on a full flight from New York City to Dallas. The plane was packed with business people, vacationers, and even a few high-profile passengers in first class. But the tension in the cabin was thick, and it had nothing to do with turbulence. No, it had everything to do with what had just happened. There stood Brianna Mallory, a flight attendant with the kind of polished smile that belonged in a toothpaste ad, if only it weren't twisted into a sneer. She was glaring down at Jamal Carter, a 6 feet 9 inches NBA star who had just asked for a simple favor, to switch seats so he could sit closer to his cousin. "What makes you think you're entitled to that seat?" Brianna hissed, her voice dripping with condescension that practically stung the air. "This isn't a basketball court where you get everything handed to you." The whole plane went silent. Passengers stared wide-eyed, some pretending not to notice, others too shocked to look away. Jamal blinked, trying to stay calm. He wasn't new to being talked down to, but this was different. "I just thought," he started, but she cut him off. "You thought what? That you could bully someone out of their seat?" Newsflash. This is America, not a game where people cheer just because you're tall. The words hit like a slap, and everyone felt it. Jamal leaned back in his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. He wasn't looking for a fight, but Brianna seemed determined to make him the villain. And then she said it, the thing no one in the cabin would ever forget. "Maybe if you learned how to act civilized, you'd get somewhere in life," Brianna muttered, her tone sharp and low enough that she must have thought no one else could hear. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A woman in the row behind Jamal dropped her drink. "Somewhere in coach," a kid whispered to his mom. "What does that mean?" Jamal clenched his jaw. "Are you serious right now?" Brianna didn't back down. If anything, her expression hardened, like she knew she was pushing a line and dared him to cross it first. That was when the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent soon. Please prepare for landing." But no one was thinking about landing. All eyes were on Jamal, Brianna, and the tension between them that was about to snap. Little did Brianna know, her words would come back to haunt her in a way she could never imagine. Because just 3 days later, she would find herself at Jamal's mercy, her very life hanging in the balance. Racist flight attendant humiliates basketball star. But days later, her life depends on him. Earlier that day, the day had started like any other for Jamal Carter. He was in New York for a press tour, his third in 2 weeks. At 29 years old, Jamal wasn't just known for his slam dunks and three-pointers. He was the face of the NBA, a philanthropist, and an inspiration to kids everywhere. But to him, he was just Jamal, the kid from Houston who got lucky because a coach believed in him when no one else did. Jamal wasn't traveling alone. His cousin Malik had tagged along, the two of them inseparable since they were kids. Malik wasn't famous, but he was family. And to Jamal, that mattered more than the cameras or the contracts. As they boarded the flight, Jamal noticed right away that their seats weren't together. Malik was in row 5, Jamal in row 7. It wasn't a big deal, but with Malik's fear of flying, Jamal figured it'd be better if they sat side by side. He flagged down a flight attendant, a young guy with a polite smile, who nodded and said he'd check if a switch was possible. Then Brianna got involved. Brianna Mallory was efficient at her job, and she knew it. 5 years as a flight attendant had taught her how to manage passengers, and she prided herself on keeping things in order. But when she spotted Jamal towering over the other passengers, asking about a seat switch, something in her bristled. She didn't recognize him at first. To her, he was just another man asking for special treatment, and she wasn't in the mood to cater to what she saw as entitlement. "No seat changes," she said sharply when the younger attendant brought it up to her. "Tell him to sit down." The younger attendant hesitated. "It's just a small switch and—" I said no. The next few minutes felt like a blur to Jamal. He'd barely asked the question before Brianna swooped in, her tone icy and her words harsher than the situation called for. Malik tried to intervene, but Jamal gave him a look that said, "Don't make this worse." He didn't want to escalate things. He just wanted to get through the flight. But Brianna seemed determined to make him feel small, lashing out with every word she spoke. And when she made that final, cutting remark about being civilized, Jamal felt something inside him shift. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't snap back. Instead, he leaned forward, meeting her glare with an expression so calm it was unnerving. "You might want to think about how you talk to people," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. Brianna didn't respond, but the smug look on her face told him she didn't care. The rest of the flight passed in uncomfortable silence, with passengers whispering and casting furtive glances at Jamal. Brianna avoided his section altogether, her polished smile nowhere to be seen. When the plane landed in Dallas, Jamal left without another word. But the incident had been caught on several phones, and by the time he arrived at his hotel, social media was already buzzing. Just as Jamal thought he could leave the drama behind, something was about to happen that would change everything, and it would bring him face to face with Brianna again. But this time, the stakes would be far higher than her pride. 3 days later, it was all over the news. Jamal Carter's name was trending, and it wasn't because of a buzzer beater or a new endorsement deal. The viral video of the flight incident had spread like wildfire. The hashtag civilized enough for you was everywhere, with fans and strangers alike flooding social media to show their support for Jamal. Meanwhile, Brianna Mallory was trending too, for all the wrong reasons. "Racist flight attendant called out by NBA star," one headline read. Another went with, "Flight attendant loses composure, loses job." Internet sleuths had already dug up her social media, and her comment sections were a mess. Some people defended her, saying the video was taken out of context. But most were demanding her resignation, calling her out for her behavior. Brianna was in hiding. She hadn't gone to work since the video blew up. Her inbox was overflowing with emails from her boss, PR reps, and friends asking if she was okay. But Brianna didn't feel okay. The internet had turned her into a villain, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure how to fix it. By the third day, she was desperate to escape. So when her friends suggested a weekend getaway to a remote cabin outside Dallas, she jumped at the chance. No Wi-Fi, no cameras, no strangers whispering behind her back. Just peace and quiet. That Friday evening, Brianna packed a bag, hopped in her old Subaru, and hit the road. The drive was supposed to be 3 hours, but halfway there, she got lost. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange, when Brianna realized she hadn't seen another car or a road sign in over 20 minutes. Her GPS had lost signal, and the map app on her phone wasn't loading. She tried to stay calm. "It's fine," she muttered to herself, gripping the wheel tighter. "I'll just keep going until I find a gas station or something." But the further she drove, the more desolate the road became. The trees lining the narrow path seemed to grow taller and denser, their branches twisting overhead like fingers locking her in. That's when it happened. The sound came first, a deafening pop, followed by a harsh thump, thump, thump. Her car jolted, swerving slightly before she managed to pull over onto the shoulder. "No, no, no," she groaned, stepping out to inspect the damage. Sure enough, her front tire was completely shredded. She glanced around, realizing just how isolated she was. There were no streetlights, no houses in sight, just the eerie glow of the moon and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Brianna pulled out her phone. No signal. "Great," she muttered. She opened the trunk, hoping the spare tire wasn't as ancient as her car. But as she fumbled around in the dim light, a chill ran down her spine. She wasn't sure why. There was nothing around, but the stillness felt wrong. She froze, listening. A twig snapped in the woods. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. She quickly turned back to the trunk, yanking out the spare and the jack. But her hands were trembling now, and she kept dropping things. The sound of another snap, closer this time, made her whip around again. "Is someone there?" Her voice echoed back at her, swallowed by the darkness. And then she saw it, a shadow, tall and broad, moving toward her from the edge of the trees. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stay back," she shouted, fumbling to grab her phone again. The figure stepped into the light, and Brianna nearly dropped the phone. It was Jamal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Brianna's brain was scrambling to process what she was seeing. What was he doing here? Why was he walking out of the woods like some ghost from her worst nightmare? "Need some help?" Jamal said finally, his tone calm, but laced with irony. Brianna's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was too stunned and too embarrassed. Jamal gestured toward the flat tire. Looks like you could use a hand. Still, she didn't respond. The last time they'd spoken, she'd humiliated him in front of an entire plane full of people. And now here he was offering to help her. Brianna stammered. Jamal shook his head, walking closer. Relax. I'm not here to hurt you. He knelt down to examine the tire, then glanced up at her. Do you even know how to change this? Brianna flushed, shaking her head. No. He sighed. All right, let's get it done. As he started working on the tire, Brianna hovered awkwardly, unsure of what to say, or if she should say anything at all. You're probably wondering what I'm doing out here, Jamal said after a moment, breaking the silence. She nodded hesitantly. My mom lives about 10 miles from here, he explained. I was visiting her and decided to go for a walk in the woods before heading back to the main road. That's when I saw your car. Brianna swallowed hard. Oh. He tightened a bolt on the spare tire, then stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. There. You're good to go. Thanks, she murmured, feeling about 2 inches tall. Jamal turned to leave, but then stopped, looking over his shoulder. You should be more careful out here. The road gets dangerous at night. And with that, he walked away, disappearing into the trees again. As Brianna drove away, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And she was right, because before the night was through, she'd find herself needing Jamal's help again. But this time, it wouldn't be just a flat tire. The spare tire didn't feel right. Brianna's car bumped and rattled down the winding road as if the whole vehicle was holding its breath. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting Jamal to appear again, though she knew that was ridiculous. Get it together, she muttered to herself. The sooner she made it to the cabin, the sooner she could collapse in a bed and forget this nightmare of a day. But then her phone buzzed. Startled, she grabbed it from the passenger's seat. The signal had returned, and a text from her friend flashed on the screen. Where are you? You should have been here by now. She quickly typed back, flat tire. Almost there. Road's creepy, though. The reply came fast. Be careful. I heard there have been some weird things happening out there. Animals or something. Brianna frowned. Animals? What kind of animals? But before she could ask, her headlights flickered. No, she whispered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The flickering grew worse, and then just like that, the headlights cut out entirely. Her car sputtered to a stop in the middle of the road. Panic set in. She turned the key again and again, but the engine wouldn't start. The only light came from the moon and her phone screen, and both suddenly felt far too dim. She grabbed her phone and opened the flashlight, aiming it at the dashboard as if that would help. But all it did was illuminate her growing fear. This is not happening, she said through gritted teeth. She stepped out of the car, phone in hand, and looked around. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, framed by trees that seemed to close in tighter the longer she stared at them. That's when she heard it. A low, guttural growl. Her blood turned to ice. She swung the flashlight toward the sound, but it was like the woods swallowed the light. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush. Brianna backed toward her car, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her phone. Hello, she called out, her voice cracking. Is someone there? The growling stopped. For a brief, agonizing moment, everything was silent again. Then, without warning, a shadow burst out of the woods, a massive animal, its eyes glowing in the dark like fire. Brianna screamed, stumbling back into her car. The creature, a wolf, but far larger than any wolf she'd ever seen, lunged toward her. She barely managed to slam the car door shut before it hit, its claws raking against the metal with a sickening screech. The beast circled the car, snarling and snapping its jaws. Brianna fumbled to lock the doors, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down long enough to see another message from her friend. Are you okay? Call me. She hit the call button with trembling fingers. The wolf slammed against the driver's side door, rocking the car. Brianna let out another scream, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. Pick up, pick up, pick up. The call went straight to voicemail. Tears streamed down her face as the wolf backed up, readying itself for another charge. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. And then she heard a loud crack, a gunshot. The wolf yelped and bolted into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Brianna opened her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Footsteps approached from the darkness. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, unsure if she should be relieved or more terrified. "Brianna," a familiar voice called out. Her jaw dropped. It was Jamal. Again. Brianna scrambled out of the car, still shaking. How are you here?" Jamal was holding a rifle, his expression calm but serious. "I heard the commotion from down the road," he said, lowering the gun. "Figured you'd need help. Looks like I was right." She stared at him, her mind racing. "That thing, what was that?" "Looked like a wolf," Jamal said, "but not the normal kind. Bigger, meaner. You're lucky it didn't get through the door." Brianna shivered, glancing toward the woods where the wolf had disappeared. "I didn't even know wolves lived out here." "They don't," Jamal replied, his voice heavy. That made her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around to the hood of her car and opened it, inspecting the engine with a frown. "Your battery's fried. No way you're driving this thing tonight." Brianna's panic spiked again. "What am I supposed to do? I can't stay out here." Jamal looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There's a clearing not far from here. I've got a cabin set up there. Just a temporary spot while I visit my mom. You can stay the night, and I'll help you get this fixed in the morning." Brianna hesitated. Staying with Jamal felt awkward, to say the least. But the thought of sitting in her car all night, waiting for that wolf, or something worse, to come back wasn't an option. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." He nodded, grabbing a flashlight from his backpack. "Stay close. The woods aren't safe after dark." As they disappeared into the trees, neither of them noticed the pair of glowing eyes watching from the shadows, tracking their every move. Something else was out there, something far more dangerous than either of them realized. The woods were eerily quiet as Jamal led Brianna through a narrow, winding path illuminated only by his flashlight. Each step felt like an echo in the stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Brianna kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the massive wolf, or whatever it was, to come charging after them. "How far is this cabin?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not far," Jamal replied without turning around. 10 minutes, maybe less. Just stay close." Brianna nodded, though she wasn't sure what staying close would even accomplish if something attacked again. The rifle slung over Jamal's shoulder gave her some comfort, but not much. "What were you even doing out here?" she asked, desperate to distract herself from the sounds of crunching leaves and snapping twigs. "I told you," Jamal said, his tone even. "Visiting my mom. I set up the cabin as a quiet spot to get away while I'm here. Didn't expect to be saving you twice in 1 week." Brianna flushed. "Yeah, well, thanks for that." He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "No problem." They walked in silence for a while, the tension between them almost as thick as the darkness. Brianna felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't really apologized for what happened on the flight, and now didn't exactly feel like the right time, but the words were bubbling up anyway. "Listen," she started, her voice hesitant. "About what happened on the plane." "Don't," Jamal said sharply, cutting her off. Brianna blinked. "What?" "Just don't," he repeated, his tone softening. "Not right now. Let's focus on getting to the cabin. We can talk later." She nodded, biting her lip. Later. If they even made it to later. The cabin finally came into view, its small, sturdy frame tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall pines. A warm light glowed from inside, spilling out onto the porch and offering a stark contrast to the cold, dark woods. Jamal unlocked the door and motioned for Brianna to step inside. The interior was cozy but sparse, a single room with a small kitchen area, a couch, and a bed tucked against one wall. A wood-burning stove crackled softly in the corner, filling the space with a comforting warmth. "You can take the couch," Jamal said, setting his rifle down by the door. Brianna nodded, sinking onto the couch with a sigh of relief. For the first time in hours, she felt a tiny sliver of safety. Jamal grabbed a kettle from the kitchen and filled it with water. "Tea?" he asked. "Sure," Brianna said, her voice quieter now. She watched him move around the cabin, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos she was still trying to process. "So," she said after a moment, "what was that thing?" "The wolf." Jamal hesitated, his back to her. "I don't know," he said finally. "But it's not the first time I've seen something weird out here." That made her sit up straighter. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, leaning against the counter. "When I was a kid, my mom used to warn me about these woods. So there were things out here that didn't belong, things that people don't talk about. I always thought it was just stories to scare me into staying close to home. But after tonight," he shook his head, "maybe she was right." Brianna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Do you think it's still out there?" "Probably," Jamal said, his expression serious. "But it won't come near the cabin. Not with the lights and the fire." She nodded, though the thought didn't make her feel much better. The kettle whistled, and Jamal poured the tea into 2 mismatched mugs, handing one to Brianna. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. For a while, they sat in silence, the crackle of the stove the only sound. Then, just as Brianna was starting to relax, there was a loud thud against the side of the cabin. Her mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. "What was that?" Jamal was already on his feet, grabbing the rifle. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. Brianna's heart pounded as she watched him move toward the door. "Wait, you're not going out there, are you?" "I need to see what it is," he said firmly. Before she could protest, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cold night air hit Jamal like a slap as he scanned the clearing, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The woods were still, the silence almost deafening. "Show yourself," he muttered under his breath, gripping the rifle tightly. Another thud came from behind the cabin. He whipped around, the beam of light catching something, no, someone moving just out of sight. "Who's there?" he called out. There was no answer. Jamal took a cautious step forward, his finger hovering over the trigger. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he approached the corner of the cabin. When he rounded it, his breath caught. A man was standing there, or at least something that looked like a man. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He was tall, impossibly tall, and his limbs seemed too long, too thin, like a spider that had stretched itself into human form. Jamal froze, his mind racing. "What the hell?" The figure tilted its head, studying him with an unsettling curiosity. Then it smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a wave of dread crashing over Jamal. Before he could react, the figure lunged. Inside the cabin, Brianna jumped as a gunshot echoed through the night, followed by a blood-curdling scream. She raced to the door, her hand hovering over the handle. But before she could open it, something slammed against the other side, shaking the entire cabin. And then silence. Brianna stood frozen, her hand trembling just inches from the door handle. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating in the silence that had fallen outside. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She wanted to call out, to scream Jamal's name, but fear clamped down on her throat like a vice. What if whatever was out there hurt her? Another loud thud rattled the door, this one hard enough to make her stumble back. Her mind raced. Was it the wolf? That thing Jamal saw? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. The rifle Jamal had carried was gone, but there was a rusty fire poker leaning against the stove. She grabbed it, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No answer. The door rattled again, and Brianna flinched, backing up until she bumped into the couch. Her stomach churned as she realized the reality of her situation. She was alone, unarmed, and trapped in the middle of nowhere. But then the rattling stopped. For a moment there was nothing, no sounds, no movement, just the oppressive quiet of the woods pressing in around her. And then bam, the door burst open, the force sending it slamming against the wall. Brianna screamed, raising the fire poker like a baseball bat. But it wasn't a monster that stumbled through the doorway. It was Jamal. He collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, his shirt torn and blood staining his arms. His rifle was gone, and his eyes were wild, darting around the room like he was still trying to process what had happened. Brianna dropped the fire poker and rushed to his side. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" Jamal held up a hand, signaling her to stop talking. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. "Lock the door," he said hoarsely. Brianna didn't argue. She ran to the door, slamming it shut and sliding the deadbolt into place. She grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle for good measure. When she turned back to Jamal, he was sitting up, leaning against the couch with a grimace. "What was it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What did you see out there?" Jamal wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing dirt and blood across his cheek. "I don't know what it was," he said, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't human. At least not anymore." Brianna's stomach churned. "What do you mean, not anymore?" "What was it?" Jamal shook his head. "It looked like a man at first, but when I got closer, I don't even know how to describe it. Its face, it wasn't right. And its eyes." He stopped, shuddering at the memory. "They glowed, like it wasn't alive, like it was something else pretending to be human." Brianna hugged herself, trying to keep the rising panic at bay. Did you kill it?" Jamal looked at her, his expression grim. "I shot it twice, point blank, and it didn't even flinch." Her heart sank. "Then how did you get away?" "It lunged at me," Jamal said, wincing as he touched his shoulder. "I don't know how, but I managed to dodge it. I ran as fast as I could back here. I don't think it followed me." As if on cue, a loud crash came from the side of the cabin. The sound of splintering wood made Brianna's blood run cold. Jamal's head snapped toward the noise. "Or maybe I'm wrong," he muttered. The sound of heavy footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there was toying with them. Jamal struggled to his feet, bracing himself against the couch. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Where are we supposed to go?" Brianna asked, her voice rising with panic. "We're in the middle of the woods, Jamal. There's nowhere to go." "There's a hunting trail about half a mile from here," Jamal said, grabbing the fire poker from where she had dropped it. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose it in the woods." "Might?" Brianna repeated, her voice trembling. "That's your plan?" "Might. It's better than sitting here, waiting to die." Jamal snapped. Another crash interrupted them, this one closer. The entire cabin shook as something slammed against the wall. Brianna's breath hitched. "Okay," she said quickly. "Okay, let's go." Jamal nodded, motioning for her to follow him. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and opened the back door, peering into the darkness. "Stay close," he whispered. They stepped outside, the cold night air biting at their skin. The woods were impossibly dark, the beam of Jamal's flashlight barely cutting through the thick shadows. Brianna's pulse pounded in her ears as they moved cautiously down the trail. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made her jump. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at her. "Do you hear that?" Jamal whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. Brianna froze, straining her ears. At first, she heard nothing, but then, faintly, came the sound of breathing, deep, guttural, and far too close. She turned to Jamal, her voice a whisper. "It's here." Before he could respond, something crashed through the trees, barreling toward them with inhuman speed. "Run!" Jamal shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her down the trail. As they sprinted through the woods, the sound of the creature's growls and snapping branches grew louder behind them. Brianna's legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she didn't dare stop. And then she saw it, up ahead, the faint glow of lights. Was it a house? A campsite? Salvation? But before they could reach it, the ground gave way beneath their feet. Both of them fell, tumbling into the darkness below. Brianna hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her side as she rolled to a stop, dirt and leaves clinging to her clothes. She coughed, trying to breathe, her ears ringing from the fall. "Jamal!" she gasped, her voice echoing in the darkness. "I'm here," came his strained reply, somewhere to her left. She turned her head, wincing as her body protested. Jamal was a few feet away, groaning as he pushed himself onto his hands and knees. He looked battered but alive. "Well, what just happened?" Brianna asked, struggling to sit up. "We fell," Jamal said, his voice tight. He shone his flashlight upward, revealing a steep slope of dirt and roots. "That thing must have scared us right into a ravine." Brianna glanced around, her heart sinking. The beam of the flashlight revealed walls of dirt and rock towering above them, enclosing them in a pit that felt impossibly deep. The faint glow of the trail lights they had been running toward was now far out of reach. "We have to get out of here," Brianna said, her voice trembling. Jamal nodded, standing slowly and offering her a hand. She took it, wincing as he pulled her to her feet. "We'll climb," he said, inspecting the walls. "It's steep, but it's not impossible." As he spoke, a sound echoed through the ravine, a low, guttural growl. Brianna froze, gripping Jamal's arm. "It's here," she whispered. Jamal swung the flashlight around, his pulse quickening. The beam caught movement, a shadow slinking along the edge of the pit, just out of reach of the light. "It's watching us," Brianna said, her voice barely audible. Jamal tightened his grip on the fire poker. "We need to move. Now." They picked a side of the ravine and began climbing, their fingers clawing at roots and rocks to pull themselves upward. The earth was loose, crumbling under their weight, and every movement sent pebbles tumbling into the darkness below. "Hurry!" Jamal urged, glancing over his shoulder. Brianna's arms burned, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She could hear the creature below, its growls growing louder, closer. Suddenly, Jamal's hand slipped. He scrambled for a hold, his foot sliding on the loose dirt. Brianna gasped as he slid downward, barely catching himself on a thick root. "Jamal!" she cried. "I'm fine," he called back, his voice strained. "Just keep climbing." But before she could move, the creature let out a deafening roar. Brianna looked down and saw it, fully illuminated by the flashlight that had fallen to the ground. It was worse than she'd imagined. The creature's body was grotesque, a twisted mockery of human and beast. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its hands ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face was gaunt, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, and its glowing eyes burned with an unnatural, menacing light. "Go!" Jamal shouted, breaking her trance. She climbed faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the creature was climbing too, its claws sinking into the dirt as it ascended with terrifying speed. Jamal reached the top first, pulling himself over the edge and immediately turning back to help Brianna. "Give me your hand," he shouted. Brianna stretched out her arm, her fingers brushing his. But just as he grabbed her wrist, the creature lunged. Its claws raked across her leg, tearing through her jeans and drawing blood. She screamed, her grip faltering. "No!" Jamal yelled, pulling her with all his strength. With one final effort, he hauled her over the edge, the two of them collapsing onto the forest floor. The creature let out a furious snarl, its claws scrabbling at the edge of the ravine. For a moment, it seemed like it might climb over. Jamal didn't hesitate. He grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the creature's face. The impact sent it tumbling backward into the pit, its roar echoing as it disappeared into the darkness. Brianna lay on her back, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. Her leg throbbed where the creature had clawed her, blood soaking through the torn fabric. "Are you okay?" Jamal asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded weakly. "I think so." Jamal tore off a piece of his shirt and tied it around her leg, trying to stem the bleeding. "We need to keep moving," he said. "That thing's not dead. It'll come back." Brianna sat up, wincing. "Jamal, what is it? Why is it after us?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice grim. "But it's not just some random animal. It's smart. It knew exactly how to trap us." She shuddered, her mind racing. "You don't think it's human, do you? Like it used to be?" Jamal didn't answer. The look in his eyes said enough. They stumbled back onto the trail, Jamal half carrying Brianna as they pushed forward. The glow of lights they had seen earlier grew brighter, closer. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing, where a ranger station stood like a beacon of hope. The building was lit, smoke curling from a chimney. "Thank God," Brianna whispered. They approached the door, Jamal pounding on it with his fist. "Hello? Is anyone here?" After a moment, the door creaked open. A man in a ranger's uniform peered out, his face lined with age and worry. "You two look like you've been through hell," the ranger said, stepping aside to let them in. "We have," Jamal said, helping Brianna inside. The warmth of the cabin was a relief, but Brianna couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced out the window, her stomach twisting. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, she saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at her. The ranger noticed her expression and followed her gaze. His face darkened. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Brianna turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Seen what?" The ranger sighed, locking the door behind them. "The thing that lives in these woods." As the ranger stoked the fire, Jamal and Brianna exchanged uneasy glances. They thought they'd escaped, but it was clear now. The nightmare was far from over. #### final chapter. The last light. The ranger locked the door behind them and turned to face Brianna and Jamal, his expression grim. His weathered face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, held a mixture of fear and resolve. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, his voice low. Jamal nodded, still gripping the fire poker. "What is it? And why is it after us?" The ranger sighed, sitting down heavily on a wooden chair. "It's not after you specifically. That thing, it doesn't care who you are. It just wants to hunt. And once it's picked up your scent, it won't stop." Brianna shivered, hugging herself. "What is it?" The ranger hesitated, glancing at the window as if expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. "We call it the Hollow Man. It's not a man at all, though, not anymore. A long time ago, this land was home to an old mining town. One of the miners went mad, killed half his crew before they found him hanging from a tree in these woods. People said his rage stayed behind, twisted into something unnatural." "Twisted into what?" Jamal pressed. The ranger shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's his spirit, some say it's something worse. All I know is it's strong, it's fast, and it's smart. And if it's marked you," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Brianna felt her throat tighten. "How do we stop it?" "You don't," the ranger said grimly. "You run, and you hope it gets bored." Jamal wasn't having it. "That's not good enough. It almost killed us out there. If we're going to survive, we need a plan." The ranger studied him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "There's only one thing that's ever worked: fire. The Hollow Man can heal from almost anything, but fire slows it down, maybe even kills it. But you'll need to trap it first." "How do we trap it?" Brianna asked. The ranger stood, opening a cabinet and pulling out a box of road flares and a jug of kerosene. "We lure it to the clearing outside, surround it with fire, and burn it while it's stuck in the circle." Jamal nodded. "All right, let's do it." The three of them moved quickly, setting up the trap in the clearing just outside the station. The ranger laid out a wide circle of kerosene, while Jamal and Brianna placed the flares at key points. The plan was simple but risky. Draw the Hollow Man into the circle, light the flares, and ignite the kerosene. Brianna's hands trembled as she held a flare. "Are you sure this will work?" "No," the ranger said bluntly. "But it's the best shot you've got.